Far Cry 7 may finally break the formula Ubisoft has followed for more than a decade, but perhaps not in a way that people expect. And recent reports claim that the next game could revolve around rescuing a kidnapped family before a 72-hour deadline. And while this makes the campaign non-linear, you may be able to choose who you rescue first, but the decision you make could determine who makes it out alive. But the newer leak goes even further, suggesting that the game could borrow from extraction shooter elements, where you enter a dangerous area, gather what you need, and try to escape while facing both AI enemies and other players. But we need to be careful here, because Ubisoft hasn't officially revealed the game, and previous reports described the main campaign and the multiplayer extraction project as two separate games, so the latest leak may be combining information from both. And even though the reactions have been interesting, Far Cry players have spent years asking Ubisoft to change the series, but now that a major change might actually be coming, many are wondering whether this is the right direction, or whether Far Cry is simply replacing one overused formula with another. But after so many years copying the same formula, it's really Ubisoft ready to make this change. But before Far Cry 3, the series was still trying to find a clear identity, and if you go back to Far Cry 1, it was built around large tropical levels, while Far Cry 2 moved towards such harsher open world. And back then, these games really delivered something different, interesting ideas, but they felt almost like separate experiments carrying the same name. But that really changed when Far Cry 3 arrived in 2012, and Ubisoft have finally found a version of Far Cry that could appeal a much larger audience. And despite the game giving plenty of control over how you approach each situation, it also made the overall experience much easier to understand. And nearly everything contributed for the Far Cry 3 protagonist, which was called Jason Brody. But his transformation wasn't only shown through the story. Far Cry 3 built it directly into the progression system. As you unlock new skills, the tattoo, as you called it tatao, on his arm continued to grow, turning the usual process of leveling up into a visible part of his character. But as Jason becomes more powerful, he slowly becomes what he fears the most. And by the end, the game even puts him in a position where he can kill his friends he originally came to save. And I can't hold myself to talk about Voss, which is the antagonist of the series. But even though he wasn't present for the entire story, his exceptional performance gave Far Cry 3 a face that people still recognize today. And this became incredibly important after the game's success, as Ubisoft no longer saw Far Cry as a series that needed to reinvent itself with every release. It now had a blueprint that could adapt to the new location and new stories. At that point, there was no reason to abandon it. The only question was whether the same structure could succeed the second time, and Far Cry 4 gave Ubisoft its answer. When the game arrived in 2014, Ubisoft didn't try to rebuild the series. It took the foundation of Far Cry 3 and moved into the Kirot. And when players compare these games today, the same opinion appears repeatedly. Far Cry 4 was the stronger game mechanically, but Far Cry 3 had the more memorable story and protagonist. And I think that is the best way to understand what Far Cry 4 accomplished. And if you think about it, the combat felt smoother. While Kirot's vertical landscape allowed Ubisoft to create more demanding encounters, outposts returned with stronger defenses, and the new fortresses expand the same concept without changing what it made enjoyable. But to be honest, Far Cry 4's story didn't catch me as a Far Cry 3 one. You felt more open worldish and not just like some animal trapped in a cage. And I think it's fair to consider that these two experiences can make a completely different game. And even though the story wasn't so comparable, the weaker character development didn't prevent Far Cry from succeeding. And not to forget that gameplay was overall more polished than the previous one. And by the end, Far Cry 4 proved that the company could change the setting and the story while keeping the same foundation underneath. And the repetition only became a problem when Far Cry 4 was followed by years of games built around the same design. And the first clear example of how easily Ubisoft could adapt the design came with Far Cry Primal. On the surface, it looked like a major departure from the previous games. Ubisoft removed modern weapons and moved the series into prehistory, but the way you progress through enemy territory remained immediately recognizable. But that wasn't necessarily a weakness, because Primal proved that Far Cry Formula could survive a dramatic change in settings, but it also showed how easily Ubisoft could reuse it. And right after, New Dawn had returned to Hope County and pushed the series much closer to an RPG. Enemies and weapons were separated into ranks, meaning the level of your equipment could sometimes matter more than how accurate you play. But unfortunately, Far Cry 6 continued in that direction while expanding the Formula design across a much larger map. But none of these games became bad simply because they share the same foundation, and each of them introduced ideas that some players genuinely enjoy. But then, what was the real problem? How did a foundation that once was praised by millions become the series' worst enemy? As every game changed a few elements, but the series as a whole became increasingly predictable. But experienced players already understood roughly how Ubisoft would organize it and what would be expected from them. And if you watch closely, Far Cry's identity was slowly becoming a production temple. And that's one of the many problems which Far Cry 7 now inherits, and Ubisoft needs to make the series feel different again. but changing too much could also remove the qualities that made people enjoy Far Cry in the first place. And so this is why the reports surrounding Far Cry 7 matter, as the Ubisoft may simply be changing the location again. This time it could be changing the structure of Far Cry itself. But Ubisoft still hasn't officially revealed Far Cry 7, but what the company has confirmed is that the two Far Cry projects are currently in development. And Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot has also said the multiplayer will become a more permanent part of the franchise in the future, and everything beyond that becomes reports and leaks. And according to earlier reporting, the main game is internally known as a Project Blackbird. A separate multiplayer project is called Maverick, and both originally began as one project before Ubisoft separated during development. And so Far Cry 7, aka Blackbird, is reportedly moving from the Dunya engine to Snowdrop and will follow a wealthy family kidnapped by a group known as the Sons of Truth. But instead of progressing through a traditional linear campaign, players may have 72 in-game hours to rescue them, and family members could be rescued in different order, and failing to reach someone in time may permanently affect the story. And the second project, on the other hand, was described as a separate multiplayer extraction shooter. However, the project was reportedly rebooted in 2025, leaving its current direction uncertain. But remember to take all this information with a grain of salt, because if this is all true, Far Cry 7 itself will include a PvP extraction gameplay and weapon durability. But unfortunately no evidence was provided, and several of those details sound very similar to what has previously been reported for Maverick. And so at this point we cannot confidently say that Far Cry 7 is becoming an extraction shooter, and the leak may simply be combining information from two different games. But what we can say is that Ubisoft appears to be experimenting with a very different structure, and even if only some of these reports are accurate, Far Cry 7 could represent the biggest change the series has made since Far Cry 3. But the real question is whether those changes solve the franchise's biggest problems, or simply replace its old formula with a newer trend. But personally, the time limit is the part that worries me the most. It feels less like a solution and more like Ubisoft experimenting because it no longer knows what to do with the series. And I would rather see Far Cry return to the simple structure where I can move through the game at my own pace. And for me, the RGB elements are totally inexcusable, as they are in every game that Ubisoft has. I do genuinely believe some people like these things, but for me, having things like health bars and weapon levels only make the game feel less believable. And I really believe Far Cry should return to the more grounded combat of Far Cry 3 and 4, where the difficulty came from the situation itself rather than the amount of health as the enemy had. And talking about the separate extraction game, I'm really more open to it. I'm personally a big fan of extraction shooters, and so Far Cry could work surprisingly well in that genre, but I think it should remain its own experience instead of forcing the main series to become something completely different. But for now, we simply need to wait and see what Ubisoft is actually making. And so, can Far Cry 7 really escape the Ubisoft formula? But changing the series only matters if Ubisoft understands what made Far Cry enjoyable in the first place. But for right now, there is still too much we don't know. Until Ubisoft officially reveals the game, all we can do is sit and wait and hope that the changes give Far Cry a new direction without completely removing its identity. But I really want to know what you think. Does Far Cry 7 need a complete reinvention, or should Ubisoft return to the simpler style of Far Cry 3 and 4? And so let me know in the comments if you enjoyed the video. Leaving a like and subscribing would genuinely help with the channel. Thank you for watching, I'll see you next time.